Hey guys, tonight we slip into a time when the world moved at the pace of dew forming on grass. You step barefoot into a meadow that's barely more than a ghost in the pale pre-dawn. The air is cold enough to make your breath look like soft smoke, and the horizon is only just beginning to tint with the shy blush of morning. Somewhere far off, a rooster offers an opinion you didn't ask for. In this light, every blade of grass is tipped with a glassy bead, tiny worlds trembling at your every step. You crouch, fingers numb, and sweep your hand through the green too. Gather your first handful of dew, cool, slippery, and impossibly pure. You probably won't survive this. If you decide to drink it all at once instead of actually doing what you came for. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love it if you posted your location and your local time in the comments. It's always fun to see who's awake with me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first handful is always the strangest. Cold, not just from the temperature, but in a way that feels older, as if it remembers nights before you were born. Historians note that in many medieval European villages, dew was thought to be sky's breath, falling invisibly during the hours when the moon was watching. There's one 14th century herbal ledger that flatly states, "Without dew, no memory spell shall hold beyond the waning." No reasoning, no experiments cited, just a confident medieval shrug. You kneel lower, pressing a strip of linen against the grass. The fibers drink the droplets until the cloth darkens like a slow blush. Somewhere in the bushes, a sparrow gives you the side eye, as if to say you're stealing his breakfast buffet. There's a faint smell of damp soil, a reminder that the ground holds yesterday's rain beneath today's treasure. And yes, dew and rain are not the same. Medieval collectors swore rain was coarse, too brash to hold delicate magics. The meadow stretches in a soft quilt of green and silver. Your fingers trace the motion again and again, wringing the wetness into a small clay jar. A fringe belief, recorded in a travelogue by a wandering friar, claims that if you spoke someone's name while collecting, you could store their memories in the dew. Historians still argue whether this was meant literally or was just a poetic insult about gossips. Either way, you whisper a name under your breath, not sure if you expect anything to happen. The first light starts to slide over the hills, and with it comes a hint of gold in the glassy beads. You pause, because once the sun rises too far, the dew loses its charm. That's what the old herbalist said. Let the day get ahead of you, and the dew remembers only itself. You're not entirely sure what that means, but you've learned not to argue with people whose wrinkles look like they've been carved by wind. You move to the meadow's edge, where the grass grows wild and tangled. Here the dew gathers in, little puddles inside curled leaves, thick as morning tears. One particularly fat drop trembles before falling, and you catch it on the tip of your finger. You imagine this single drop might carry the echo of last night's moonlight, and if you could listen closely enough, you might hear a whisper. Instead, all you hear is the distant bleat of a sheep who sounds mildly annoyed at life in general. You fill your jar halfway before the light grows too warm. This will do for the first day's gathering. A humble start to something much older than you, much older than the village that sleeps behind you. You cork the jar gently, tucking it into your satchel with the care of someone who knows a careless bump could spill hours of quiet work. And as you head back toward the dirt path, you can't shake the sense that every blade of grass is watching you leave, their dewdrops blinking in slow farewell. The path home feels longer than it should, your satchel pulling at your shoulder as if the dew inside has gained the weight of secrets. You keep glancing down, half expecting it to glow, though of course it doesn't. Not yet. The old herbalist warned you once, in that sideways way of hers, that the real trick wasn't catching the dew, but catching it at the right moment. There's common dew, she'd said, and then there's memory-rich dew. Only fools pretend they're the same. She'd leaned in close then, breath like dried thyme, and added, and only certain mornings gift you the second kind. Her criteria were maddeningly vague. She claimed the right morning could be smelled, sharp, green, with a trace of sky metal on the air. Historians still argue whether this sky metal was her poetic way of describing ozone after a storm, or whether she was hinting at meteor dust, which is, in fairness, an actual thing in the upper atmosphere. But medieval villagers didn't need science to back them up. They trusted noses, not laboratories. You remember the first time you tried collecting without her. It was midsummer, the grass thick with dew, and you'd thought you'd hit the jackpot. Hours later, when you distilled it for a memory charm, the herbalist sniffed and declared it as empty as a chicken's sympathy. The phrase didn't make sense then, and honestly, it still doesn't. This morning, though, the air had that metallic tang, like the edge of a coin pressed to your tongue. The wind had been still, and the clouds had cleared in the night. All of which, according to her, meant the dew might carry the moon's soft print, whatever that was. Medieval belief held that the moon's reflection in each drop could fix thoughts like pigment fixes to parchment. It's the kind of idea that would get you laughed out of a modern lecture. But it made perfect sense when you saw her hands moving through the grass like she was playing a harp only she could hear. As you walk, you picture her bent over a bundle of drying sage, muttering about last year's harvest and its lazy dew. The memory makes you smile despite the way the chill is gnawing at your fingertips. You imagine her approving of this morning's catch. Unless, of course, she found something to nitpick, which she always did. She believed perfection was a moving target. You could always gather better dew, finer dew, more cooperative dew. A dog barks in the distance, breaking the dawn hush. Somewhere a shutter slams, and you catch the smell of baking bread drifting from the baker's cottage. That smell is almost enough to make you abandon the satchel and go barter for a loaf. Almost. But you push on, because dew waits for no one. Once it's gathered, the work has only begun. You think of one fringe tale she told you, about a scribe who collected dew from the petals of white roses grown in graveyards. Supposedly, his memory spells lasted, not just for years, but lifetimes. Historians still argue whether this is allegory, superstition, or just one of those "don't try this at home" medieval cautionary tales. Personally, you've never been tempted. Rose thorns are one thing. The look on a grieving widow's face when you start picking flowers from her husband's grave is quite another. The sun pushes a little higher, warming the dirt road under your boots. Your jar stays cool, pressed against your hip, and you can almost feel the tiny droplets shifting inside. You wonder if they know you, if they could carry your own memories back to someone else. It's the sort of thought that feels safe in the morning light, but you wouldn't say it aloud in the tavern. Not unless you wanted to be on the receiving end of that look from half the village. As the cottage roofs come into view, you catch sight of the herbalist's crooked chimney. Smoke rises in a lazy ribbon, catching the light like a soft banner. You imagine stepping through her door, setting the jar on her worn table, and waiting for her to pass judgment. You imagine her smile, small, approving, and maybe a little proud. It's a fragile picture, and you hold on to it as you step into the yard, the morning dew still damp on your cuffs. Hey guys, tonight we slip into a time when the world moved at the pace of dew forming on grass. You step barefoot into a meadow that's barely more than a ghost in the pale pre-dawn. The air is cold enough to make your breath look like soft smoke, and the horizon is only just beginning to tint with the shy blush of morning. Somewhere far off, a rooster offers an opinion you didn't ask for. In this light, every blade of grass is tipped with a glassy bead, tiny worlds trembling at your every step. You crouch, fingers numb, and sweep your hand through the green too. Gather your first handful of dew, cool, slippery, and impossibly pure. You probably won't survive this. If you decide to drink it all at once instead of actually doing what you came for. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love it if you posted your location and your local time in the comments. It's always fun to see who's awake with me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first handful is always the strangest. Cold, not just from the temperature, but in a way that feels older, as if it remembers nights before you were born. Historians note that in many medieval European villages, dew was thought to be sky's breath, falling invisibly during the hours when the moon was watching. There's one 14th century herbal ledger that flatly states, "Without dew, no memory spell shall hold beyond the waning." No reasoning, no experiments cited, just a confident medieval shrug. You kneel lower, pressing a strip of linen against The grass. The fibers drink the droplets until the cloth darkens like a slow blush. Somewhere in the bushes, a sparrow gives you the side eye, as if to say you're stealing his breakfast buffet. There's a faint smell of damp soil, a reminder that the ground holds yesterday's rain beneath today's treasure. And yes, dew and rain are not the same. Medieval collectors swore rain was coarse, too brash to hold delicate magics. The meadow stretches in a soft quilt of green and silver. Your fingers trace the motion again and again, wringing the wetness into a small clay jar. A fringe belief, recorded in a travelogue by a wandering friar, claims that if you spoke someone's name while collecting, you could store their memories in the dew. Historians still argue whether this was meant literally or was just a poetic insult about gossips. Either way, you whisper a name under your breath, not sure if you expect anything to happen. The first light starts to slide over the hills, and with it comes a hint of gold in the glassy beads. You pause, because once the sun rises too far, the dew loses its charm. That's what the old herbalist said. Let the day get ahead of you, and the dew remembers only itself. You're not entirely sure what that means, but you've learned not to argue with people whose wrinkles look like they've been carved by wind. You move to the meadow's edge, where the grass grows wild and tangled. Here the dew gathers in, little puddles inside curled leaves, thick as morning tears. One particularly fat drop trembles before falling, and you catch it on the tip of your finger. You imagine this single drop might carry the echo of last night's moonlight, and if you could listen closely enough, you might hear a whisper. Instead, all you hear is the distant bleat of a sheep who sounds mildly annoyed at life in general. You fill your jar halfway before the light grows too warm. This will do for the first day's gathering. A humble start to something much older than you, much older than the village that sleeps behind you. You cork the jar gently, tucking it into your satchel with the care of someone who knows a careless bump could spill hours of quiet work. And as you head back toward the dirt path, you can't shake the sense that every blade of grass is watching you leave, their dewdrops blinking in slow farewell. The path home feels longer than it should, your satchel pulling at your shoulder as if the dew inside has gained the weight of secrets. You keep glancing down, half expecting it to glow, though of course it doesn't. Not yet. The old herbalist warned you once, in that sideways way of hers, that the real trick wasn't catching the dew, but catching it at the right moment. There's common dew, she'd said, and then there's memory-rich dew. Only fools pretend they're the same. She'd leaned in close then, breath like dried thyme, and added, and only certain mornings gift you the second kind. Her criteria were maddeningly vague. She claimed the right morning could be smelled, sharp, green, with a trace of sky metal on the air. Historians still argue whether this sky metal was her poetic way of describing ozone after a storm, or whether she was hinting at meteor dust, which is, in fairness, an actual thing in the upper atmosphere. But medieval villagers didn't need science to back them up. They trusted noses, not laboratories. You remember the first time you tried collecting without her. It was midsummer, the grass thick with dew, and you'd thought you'd hit the jackpot. Hours later, when you distilled it for a memory charm, the herbalist sniffed and declared it as empty as a chicken's sympathy. The phrase didn't make sense then, and honestly, it still doesn't. This morning, though, the air had that metallic tang, like the edge of a coin pressed to your tongue. The wind had been still, and the clouds had cleared in the night. All of which, according to her, meant the dew might carry the moon's soft print, whatever that was. Medieval belief held that the moon's reflection in each drop could fix thoughts like pigment fixes to parchment. It's the kind of idea that would get you laughed out of a modern lecture. But it made perfect sense when you saw her hands moving through the grass like she was playing a harp only she could hear. As you walk, you picture her bent over a bundle of drying sage, muttering about last year's harvest and its lazy dew. The memory makes you smile despite the way the chill is gnawing at your fingertips. You imagine her approving of this morning's catch, unless, of course, she found something to nitpick, which she always did. She believed perfection was a moving target. You could always gather better dew, finer dew, more cooperative dew. A dog barks in the distance, breaking the dawn hush. Somewhere a shutter slams, and you catch the smell of baking bread drifting from the baker's cottage. That smell is almost enough to make you abandon the satchel and go barter for a loaf. Almost. But you push on, because dew waits for no one. Once it's gathered, the work has only begun. You think of one fringe tale she told you, about a scribe who collected dew from the petals of white roses grown in graveyards. Supposedly, his memory spells lasted, not just for years, but lifetimes. Historians still argue whether this is allegory, superstition, or just one of those "don't try this at home" medieval cautionary tales. Personally, you've never been tempted. Rose thorns are one thing. The look on a grieving widow's face when you start picking flowers from her husband's grave is quite another. The sun pushes a little higher, warming the dirt road under your boots. Your jar stays cool, pressed against your hip, and you can almost feel the tiny droplets shifting inside. You wonder if they know you, if they could carry your own memories back to someone else. It's the sort of thought that feels safe in the morning light, but you wouldn't say it aloud in the tavern. Not unless you wanted to be on the receiving end of that look from half the village as the cottage roofs come into view. You catch sight of the herbalist's crooked chimney. Smoke rises in a lazy ribbon, catching the light like a soft banner. You imagine stepping through her door, setting the jar on her worn table, and waiting for her to pass judgment. You imagine her smile, small, approving, and maybe a little proud. It's a fragile picture, and you hold on to it as you step into the yard, the morning dew still damp on your cuffs. Years turn like pages, and the vials on your shelf gather a different kind of dust. Your hands, once steady in the cold dawn, grow slower, the joints aching on damp mornings. You still rise early sometimes, but more often you find yourself watching the meadow from the window rather than walking into it. The dew is there, glimmering as it always has, but the pull to gather it is softer now, like a song you can hum without singing aloud. You begin to wonder, quietly at first, then more often, if the magic was ever truly in the dew at all. Maybe Brother Aldrich had been right all along. Maybe the charms worked because people believed they would, because they carried their vows and promises with the weight of expectation. A mainstream fact. Across history, entire systems of healing, fortune-telling, and blessing have thrived on the strength of belief, regardless of whether the materials used had any measurable effect. Historians still argue whether this diminishes the practice or proves its deeper power. There's a fringe belief among some collectors that doubt itself can unbind stored dew, letting the memory threads drift away. You catch yourself wondering if your own uncertainty is doing just that, loosening the knots you tied in other people's minds. You look at the neat labels, the careful handwriting, and think about all the moments you've preserved. Are they still out there, intact, or have they faded like ink left in the sun? On a clear spring morning, you take one of your oldest vials, the May dew from the first year you worked alone, and unstopper it. You tip a drop onto your palm. It's cool, faintly scented with rosemary, and utterly ordinary. And yet, as you rub it between your fingers, you remember the way the meadow smelled that morning, the way the horizon turned gold, the way your younger self thought this was the start of something endless. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that was always the point. One chilly morning, you find a knock at the door, not the polite double tap of a neighbor, but the hesitant, rapid rhythm of someone who's been standing there debating whether to run away. When you open it, there's a child, no more than 10, clutching a strip of rough linen in one hand and a dented silver cup in the other. Her boots are muddy, her nose red, and her eyes wide with the nervous energy of someone about to ask for something important. She explains in a rush that she's heard the stories, the ones about how you can catch a moment so it won't slip away, and she wants to learn. She doesn't care if it's real, not really. She just wants to try. Something in the way she says it reminds you of your own voice, decades ago, when you first begged the herbalist to show you the linen trick. You take her to the meadow, now, wearing its spring green again, and show her how to press the cloth to the grass so gently that the droplets slide into it without a tremble. She giggles at the cold, wrings the cloth over the cup, and stares as the water gathers in the bottom like a tiny, liquid treasure. A mainstream fact. In many medieval trades, the passing of skills from elder to apprentice wasn't just practical. It was the only way knowledge survived at all. Historians still argue whether folk practices like dew collecting were usually kept in families or shared freely with anyone who showed interest. You give her one of your spare linen strips and a small cork bottle, telling her to label whatever she collects and keep it in a cool, dark place. She nods solemnly, as if you've just handed her the key to a secret door. As you watch her run back toward the village, the bottle tucked close, you feel something you hadn't expected, a flicker of the old excitement, the sharp joy of starting out. It occurs to you that maybe the real magic isn't in the do it all, but in the act of passing the cup to the next set of hands. The years have thinned your steps, but not your curiosity. One final spring morning, you rise before the bells, pulling on your cloak as the horizon blushes faintly. The meadow waits, beaded and bright, the grass bending slightly under the weight of its own jewelry. You walk slowly, not from reluctance, but to let the air settle into your lungs. Cool, clean, faintly sweet that you've brought only a single strip of linen today, worn soft from use. The antler rack stays in its corner, the silver bowls on their shelf. This is not a day for filling shelves. This is a day for filling your hands. You kneel, press the cloth gently, and watch as the droplets vanish into the weave. The sound is the same as always, almost nothing at all, but it carries the weight of every morning you've ever done this. A mainstream fact. Repetition, in both craft and ritual, is often what gives a tradition its power. Historians still argue whether that power is inherent or simply born from familiarity and trust. You've stopped needing to choose between those explanations. When the cloth is heavy, you wring it into your oldest silver bowl, the one with the dent from that summer market long ago. The dew pools there, trembling, holding the whole sky in miniature. You don't distill it. You don't add rosemary or relic dust. You simply lift the bowl, take a slow sip, and let it rest on your tongue. That there's a fringe belief that drinking the last do you ever gather will tie you to the land where it was taken, letting you walk it in memory long after you're gone. You don't know if that's true, but as you sit back in the grass, the sun climbing, you feel no rush to leave. The meadow hums quietly around you, and you close your eyes, storing it all without any jars, labels, or shelves. The dew will vanish in minutes. The memory will not. The meadow softens around you, edges blurring as the morning settles into something slower, gentler. The air is warmer now, carrying the faint scent of earth turning under the sun. Somewhere, a lark drifts into its song, the notes rising and falling like they've been part of this field forever. You listen without needing to remember, just letting the sound pass through you. The way dew slides into the roots without a trace. Your body feels heavier, but in a way that's more grounding than tiring. The grass beneath you presses into your palms, cool and steady, a quiet reminder of where you are. The silver bowl rests beside you, the last droplets inside catching the light in lazy glimmers. You don't reach for them. Some things are meant to stay exactly where they are, even if only for a little while longer. The wind moves through the meadow in long, unhurried breaths. Each sigh bends the grass in slow waves, a rhythm so easy it might carry you with it. You close your eyes and let the light turn warmer on your face, the shapes behind your eyelids shifting in soft gold and green. Thoughts grow quieter here. You're not trying to hold on to them, not trying to trap them like water in a jar. You just watch them drift past, easy as clouds over the ridge. The field feels wider with each breath, until you're not sure where you end and the morning begins. Somewhere far off, a single drop falls from a blade of grass. The sound so small you'd miss it if you weren't listening. You catch it anyway, and let it fade into the hush, a last perfect moment dissolving into the day, and now you rest. 2 mornings later, the air in the village is thick with the smell of damp earth, the kind that promises rain by afternoon. You've just returned from the grove, a small jar of replacement dew in hand, when a knock at the door interrupts your plans to rescue the wounded batch. This time, it's not a neighbor or a curious monk. It's a courier in the Baron's livery. He bows slightly and produces a sealed letter. Inside, the steward's tidy script explains that your last commission, the bridal dew, has already found its way into more than just wedding vows. It seems the vial was also used in a private exchange between the Baron's daughter and a certain visiting lord. The steward doesn't name him outright, but you can read between the lines. Political maneuvering, the kind done in whispers and careful glances. The steward's request, no instruction, is clear. Prepare another vial for the Baron himself. This time for a message he intends to send across the border to a rival lord. You understand the subtext. Whatever is written with this dew is meant to lodge in the rival's mind like a burr in wool, perhaps to unsettle, perhaps to seduce at a mainstream fact. Medieval courts often used subtler methods than open threats. Gifts, symbols, or crafted phrases meant to influence as much as any sword. Historians still argue whether memory charms, when mentioned in chronicles, were literal tools or poetic ways of describing persuasive writing. You hesitate. The dew was meant for keeping, preserving personal vows, safeguarding traits, not for court intrigue. But refusing a noble is rarely without consequence. You nod to the courier, telling him it will be ready in 5 days, and close the door with the heavy awareness that you've just agreed to make yourself part of someone else's. Game.as You set the fresh jar beside the salvage drops from Porge's mishap. You can't help thinking that memory is neutral. It remembers whatever it's told to. But the teller's intent? That's never neutral. And that, perhaps, is where the real magic lives. 5 days to prepare, and the weather decides to turn into a wet, sullen child. Instead of crisp mornings with beads clinging politely to each blade of grass, you get heavy, drenching mist and nights so damp the air feels like it's trying to sit in your lungs. The bowls you set out collect plenty of water, but it's thick with runoff from leaves and the faint, sour smell of over-saturation that in the herbalist's words, this is lazy dew. Dew that's been bullied into existence by weather rather than coaxed out by the slow breathing of the ground. Mainstream observation. Prolonged wet weather in medieval times often disrupted agricultural tasks that relied on specific moisture levels, like drying hay or curing grain. Historians still argue whether dew collection for charms was ever treated with the same urgency, but in your small corner of craft, the answer is a definite yes. You adapt. Instead of open meadow, you shift to covered patches beneath tall trees, where the leaves shelter the grass from the worst of the mist. You line the bowls with fresh linen to filter debris, change your gathering route so you move upslope instead of down, and start the process earlier. While the air still holds a hint of the night's chill, the yield is smaller, but finer. The droplets you gather under the oak at the grove's edge have a clarity the rest of the field can't match this week. Into the distillation pan they go, joined by the now familiar sprig of rosemary, and, for the baron's purposes, a pinch of powdered silver. The fringe belief is that silver sharpens the thought the dew carries, making it harder for the recipient to shake. Whether it works or not, the effect is subtle and oddly beautiful. A faint glimmer in the coil as the distillate slides down, by the time the vial is sealed. The rain has begun again, pattering on the shutters like impatient fingers. You set it in a padded box, label it with the moon's phase, and wonder what words will be written with it, and whether the person reading them will know they've been given a message meant to linger far longer than it should. The rains don't stop. They simply harden into winter. The fields trade their greens for browns, then for the muffled white of early snow. The morning air that once smelled of wet grass now carries the sting of wood smoke and frozen earth. You still wake early, out of habit, but the meadows were no dew this time of year. Just frost, sharp and brittle, glinting like glass shards under the pale sun. Winter is a lean season for your craft. Without fresh dew, you turn to the vials collected through spring and summer, each sealed moment a small rebellion against the calendar. Some you decant into charms for neighbors, a drop for the schoolmaster to keep track of lessons, a wedding gift for a young couple marrying despite the cold. Others you save, the labels neat and deliberate. May meadow, forest edge, hilltop hum. A mainstream fact. In many medieval European traditions, winter was the time for preserving and planning, not gathering. Work shifted indoors, spinning wool, repairing tools, copying manuscripts. Historians still argue whether seasonal folk practices like yours were paused entirely or simply altered to fit the season's limits. There's a fringe belief that winter dreams are sharper than summer ones, and that sipping a drop of stored dew before bed will bring vivid visions. You test it one night, adding a bead from the watchtower hum batch to your tea. The dream that follows is strange but not unpleasant. A field under moonlight, each blade of grass whispering in a language you almost understand. You wake to the stillness of snow and the knowledge that the first dew of spring is months away. Until then, you wait, tending the fire, mending cloths, and running your fingers over the vials like a miser counting coin, not for their worth in trade, but for the mornings they contain, caught and kept against the hunger of the season. The first thaw comes quietly, a subtle loosening of the ground and a shift in the air that smells faintly of wet bark and waking roots. You feel it before you see it, the way the wind no longer bites quite so hard, the way the sun lingers a little longer on the ridge. By the second morning, the snow in the meadow has shrunk into ragged patches, and dark, damp soil peeks through like the first line of a long-forgotten letter. The herbalist meets you at the field's edge, wrapped in her patched cloak, a crooked grin beneath her hood. She hasn't joined you for a gathering in years. "It's time," she says simply, and together you walk to the spot where the grass is already greening. The dew is thin but fresh, trembling on each blade as though shy from its long absence. She shows you, once more, the patient motions: how to press the linen so it lifts the droplets whole, how to tilt the bowl so the light doesn't chase them away. Her hands are slower now, the veins standing like pale rivers beneath her skin, but her movements are precise, almost ceremonial. When the jars are half full, she gestures for you to stop. From her satchel, she produces a small pouch of dried petals, violet, edged in silver, and drops a pinch into your bowl. The scent is sweet and faintly spicy. "The true source of the spell," she says, "isn't the dew. It's the moment you decide to remember." She tilts her head toward the horizon. The dew is just a vessel for that choice. A mainstream fact. In many pre-modern traditions, the act of ritual itself, regardless of ingredients, was often considered the most important element of magic. Historians still argue whether the power was ever in the materials or always in the mind of the maker. You finish the morning's work in companionable silence. Back at your cottage, you distill the dew with the petals, sealing the vial, with her thumbprint beside yours. It's the only batch you label without a date or location. Instead, you write a single word: lesson. A week after the fair, you find yourself climbing the long slope to the old watchtower ruin. The path is barely more than a goat trail now, winding through patches of gorse and low brambles that scratch at your boots. You've heard the stories, everyone in the village has, about the hilltop dew that sings when gathered on certain mornings. The herbalist used to wave a hand at the legend, saying, "If it sings, it's only because you're too sleepy to hear your own thoughts." Still, she never told you not to try. The tower itself is a skeleton of stone, its upper walls collapsed long ago, leaving only a ring that frames the sky. From here, the horizon runs unbroken, the fields and woods falling away like the folds of a vast, rumpled cloak. The wind moves differently up here, slow and deliberate, carrying scents from miles away: heather, distant wood smoke, the faint tang of the sea. Even though the coast is half a day's walk, you step into the grass at the base of the tower and see it immediately. Beads of dew larger than any you've gathered in the meadows below, clinging to each blade as if reluctant to let go. When you bend close, the air shifts, and there's a faint hum, so soft you can't tell if it's in your ears or in the grass itself. Historians still argue whether singing dew was ever anything more than wind moving through particular plants, but the stories have lasted for centuries. That alone makes you pay attention. You lay out your linen, letting it rest over the richest patches, then take up the antler rack for a slow, steady pass. The droplets slide into the cloth as if guided, merging into a cool weight in your hands. You wring them into your silver bowl, and for just a moment, the hum seems louder, then fades, replaced by the usual drip and trickled. There's a fringe belief that dew gathered here will help recall not just personal memories, but the memories of a place, its history, its forgotten moments. You can't prove that, but as you pack the jar and start down the hill, you feel an odd sense of carrying not just water, but a story too large to fit into words. Back in the village, you're barely through the cottage door when Brother Aldrich, the monk from the abbey 3 miles away, appears at your table as though he stepped straight out of the mist. His robe smells faintly of vellum and beeswax, and his expression is the same one he wears when about to ask an uncomfortable question, polite, but with a sharp hook hidden under the words. "I've been reading some accounts," he begins, "about your practice." You pour him a cup of the herbal tea he likes, partly to be hospitable, partly to buy yourself a moment. Aldrich is not a man to be dismissed. His mind is quick, his memory sharper than any quill, and he has a way of making doubt sound like a blessing. He's skeptical, of course. He asks if you've ever compared the memories of those who've used your do charms against those who haven't. He wonders aloud whether the results might be explained by belief alone, the mind convincing itself to remember because it expects. 2. Historians still argue whether most medieval folk practices worked through direct effect or through the softer alchemy of suggestion. You've read enough to know that placebo is a word centuries younger than the practice itself. You tell him about the Baron's commission, the forest edge dew, even the singing beads from the watchtower hill. He listens, his eyes narrowing slightly at the more extravagant claims. And yet, he says, you cannot show me the thing itself. Only stories of what it has done. His tone isn't mocking, but it isn't yielding either. There's a fringe belief you've heard whispered, that doubt, spoken aloud near a vial, can weaken its power. You don't believe it, but you still find yourself shifting the row of vials a little further from him on the table. Aldrich leaves with the same mild expression he brought in, promising to reflect further. You watch him go, knowing that whether or not he's convinced, the conversation itself will become another layer in the long history of people asking whether magic is real or just a reflection in the mind's own dude that you've barely settled. Back into your chair after Aldrich's visit when disaster strikes. Quietly, clumsily, and with the smug inevitability of a cat. Your tabby, Porridge, has decided that the shelf above your workbench is an ideal place to practice acrobatics. One misjudged leap, a thump, a scrabble of claws, and then the unmistakable shattering sound of glass against floorboards, you freeze. The scent of rosemary and cool mineral rises instantly, the unmistakable breath of a freshly spilled batch. Your eyes find the culprit, a spreading puddle of silver-tinged dew creeping toward the hearth. Porridge sits in the middle of it, tail twitching, looking deeply unrepentant. This was no ordinary jar. It held dew gathered from the oak-shadowed grove, infused overnight with the so-called memory moss from the pilgrim at the fair. You'd been saving it for a personal experiment, maybe even a charm for yourself. Now it's soaking into the wood, and the only spell you can cast is a muttered string of phrases the herbalist would have scolded you for. At a mainstream fact. Medieval apothecaries often worked in cramped spaces where one accident could ruin months of work, spilled tinctures, cracked alembics, or, yes, over-curious animals. Historians still argue whether this is why so many recipes were written to be made in small, repeatable batches rather than great quantities all at once. You grab a scrap of linen and try to salvage what you can, blotting the floor and wringing a few drops into a clean cup. It's barely enough to coat the bottom. Fringe collectors insist that even a wounded batch like this can be revived if combined with fresh dew from the same source before 3 nights pass. You decide to test that claim, though it will mean another chilly dawn trip to the grove. Porridge, apparently satisfied with her work, curls up on the windowsill. You glance at her and sigh. There's no real anger in it, just the knowledge that memory, like glass, can be more fragile than you'd like to admit. And sometimes you have to start again. The commission's safely boxed. You turn your thoughts back to your own stores, specifically to the jar you left in the outer pantry after last week's harvest. When you lift it from the shelf, you notice something unusual. The droplets inside have clumped into tiny spheres, each one rigid and glittering. Overnight, the early frost had crept in, turning your prized dew into a constellation of ice pearls. They're beautiful, no question, and you find yourself tilting the jar just to watch them roll against the glass like slow marbles. But beauty isn't the same as usefulness. The herbalist used to warn about this. Once frozen, dew forgets itself. She claimed the delicate structure that held the memory threads collapsed in the cold, leaving only water's empty shell. Historians still argue whether this is poetic superstition or an accidental nod to actual changes in surface tension and dissolved compounds. You decide to test it. Setting the jar by the hearth, you let the frost pearls melt into cool liquid again, then pour a little into your silver bowl for a trial charm. The process feels the same. Slow heating, rosemary scent, the steady drip into the receiver. But when you hold the finished vial, there's something missing. No faint shimmer, no subtle pull at the back of your thoughts. Just a clear, clean drop of morning that might as well have been drawn from the well. Still, you can't quite bring yourself to throw it out. There's a fringe belief among some collectors that frozen dew is sleeping rather than ruined, and that certain chants can wake it again. You haven't learned those chants yet, but you label the vial and set it apart, just in case. The frost won't be a daily problem until winter proper, but it's a reminder that the craft isn't just about skill, it's about timing. And sometimes, even the most careful preparation can be undone by a single, silent night that a week later. You pack a small crate with vials and head for the border town fair, the annual muddle of noise, color, and smells that somehow manages to draw everyone within a day's walk. The road is busy long before you reach the gates. Farmers driving squealing pigs, a peddler balancing baskets on a pole across his shoulders, children already sticky-faced from some early morning sweet. The fairgrounds stretch in a patchwork of stalls, canvas awnings snapping in the breeze. You're sandwiched between a juggler in a red cap and a spice seller whose table is a riot of saffron yellows and paprika reds. Your own stall is modest. A strip of linen over two trestles, a row of corked vials catching the light, and a neat hand-lettered sign, "Do writing demonstration." Preserve a thought before it wanders. It's a hook and it works. People drift. Over-curious. You dip a quill into a small dish of dew and let the clear liquid thread across parchment. At first, it's invisible. Then, as you tip the page, the line flashes briefly silver before disappearing again. The children gasp, the adults lean closer. You explain, gently, with a smile, that the dew will hold the words, and that anyone who reads them by candlelight after 3 nights will remember them, as if they'd been etched in their own minds. A mainstream fact. Medieval fairs really did host demonstrations of crafts, both practical and mystical, from locksmiths showing off new mechanisms to herbalists boiling up cures on the spot. Historians still argue whether memory charms were genuinely offered or whether they survive only as colorful invention in chroniclers' accounts. One woman pays for a vial on the spot, saying she intends to write her son's school lessons with it. A merchant buys 2, muttering about a shipment he doesn't want to forget to collect. Even the juggler trades you a handful of candied almonds for a drop. "For my routines," he says, though you suspect he just likes the novelty. By day's end, your crate is lighter, your pouch heavier, and your voice a little hoarse from explaining. As you pack up, the spice seller leans over, eyes gleaming. "Next year," he says, "we should pair your dew with my cinnamon. Imagine memories that smell like winter bread." You laugh, because the idea is ridiculous, and yet not entirely without merit. The fair is still in full voice when you wander away from your stall, drawn toward a line of brightly painted carts where travelers sell goods you've never seen in the village. Between a glass blower shaping tiny animals and a woman weaving belts on a portable loom, you find a man with a display of dried herbs, so varied it looks like he's plucked entire seasons from the ground and hung them here to dry. He's a pilgrim. He explains, though his route sounds less like a holy journey and more like an elaborate excuse to see every market in the region. His bundles include the usual rosemary, sage, and thyme, but also stranger fare, sprigs of spiky lavender from the coast, pale leaves of something called lion's ear, and a small pouch of deep purple petals that he claims grow only on the slopes of a southern mountain. You tell him about your craft, carefully, the way you might tell a stranger where you hide your best wine, and he nods as if he's been expecting you. From beneath the table, he produces a wrapped packet, untying the string to reveal what looks like dried moss, fine and silvery. Memory moss, he calls it. Boil it with your dew. Works better than rosemary. At least, that's what the monks in Seravalle say. Historians still argue whether memory moss was a real botanical used in medieval Europe or just a romantic name for some ordinary lichen. But the scent is intriguing, sharp and cool, like mint hiding in a forest. You trade him 2 small vials of forest-edge dew for the packet, each of you claiming the better end of the bargain. On the walk back to your stall, you imagine the experiments, infusing the moss during distillation, or perhaps steeping it overnight in the gathered dew before the heat touches it. Fringe collectors claim that foreign herbs carry memories of far-off skies and can give their drinker a vision of places they've never been. You're skeptical, But the idea of adding a new note to the familiar tune of rosemary and sage is too tempting to ignore, by the time the fair begins to wind down. The packet is tucked safely in your satchel, already feeling like a promise waiting for the right morning. By the time you return from the market, the ribbon's safely coiled in your pouch. The steward's news has been chasing itself around your thoughts. A baron's daughter wanting a memory spell. Well, that's not the sort of request you turn away. Not unless you enjoy explaining yourself to someone who owns most of the roofs you live under. You don't have to wait long before the knock comes that it's not the steward himself, but a pair of the baron's household servants, cloaks lined with fur and boots so clean they might as well have floated over the muddy lane. They deliver the request in that polite but not really asking way nobles have perfected, a vial of dew, distilled under favorable conditions, to be given to the bride on her wedding day. It's to be woven into her vows, so she may never forget them. And, one imagines, so she may never forget to obey them. You don't say that part aloud. Historians still argue whether nobles in medieval Europe actually used such folk practices for sentimental reasons, or whether it was all symbolic ornamentation. Whatever the truth, the coin purse they place on your table is as heavy as a moral dilemma, and you're not in the habit of refusing either. The specifications are precise. The dew must be gathered on a morning when the moon is 3 nights past full, from grass that has not been grazed in the past month. You make a note to speak to the shepherd about fencing off a patch. The distillation is to include a measure of rosemary for remembrance and a shred of cloth from the bride's gown, which means someone in the manor sewing room will be looking the other way for a moment. It's a strange feeling, preparing something so personal for someone you've never met. You imagine the young woman repeating her vows, voice steady, while this tiny, invisible thread of morning dew weaves itself into the fabric of her memory. Will it work? Maybe. Will she believe it works? Almost certainly. That's the part that matters. You send the servants off with the promise it will be ready in 3 weeks, and when the door closes, you sit for a long moment, listening to the faint slosh of dew in your vials. There's a kind of weight to the work now, heavier than a ribbon or a gossip's favor. You're no longer just keeping memories for yourself. You're making them for others, tying knots in time they don't even know they're wearing. 3 weeks isn't long when you're waiting on the moon to take exactly 3 lazy steps past full. The mornings leading up to it are spent pacing the weather, peering at clouds like they owe you rent. Too much rain, and the grass will be soggy rather than beaded. Too much wind, and the dew will scatter before you even get the cork out of your jar. While you're watching the sky, the village is busy watching itself. Down at the tavern, the argument has resurfaced. Rainwater versus dew. It starts, as it always does, with someone insisting that rain and dew are the same, just with different bedtime stories. Across the table, someone else snorts that rainwater is heavy, coarse, and far too blunt to hold a thought the way dew can. You're drawn in before you know it, sipping your ale slowly as the points volley back and forth at a mainstream fact you've read in an herbal compendium. Dew and rainwater do differ in composition. Dew picks up compounds from the air near the ground and from the plants themselves, while rain often carries whatever it's gathered on its long fall from the clouds. Whether that's enough to make one remember better than the other is anyone's guess. Historians still argue whether medieval practitioners actually understood the difference or simply assigned one a loftier role because it was harder to obtain. Then there's the fringe crowd, who claim rainwater has its own magic, storm-born energy, sharp and restless, better for spells meant to stir than to settle. You've tried it once, years ago, out of curiosity. The resulting charm didn't fail exactly, but it did leave the recipient with a habit of tapping their foot constantly, which wasn't the intended outcome. By the time the moon hits the right phase, the debate has died down, the tavern door creaking shut behind the last stubborn voices. You rise before dawn, stepping into a meadow that seems to hum under its skin. The air is still, the grass untouched. As the first light warms the horizon, you sweep the cloth across the blades, each droplet clinging like a held breath. This is dew with intent, and you can almost feel it knowing where it's meant to go. The special commission means following the recipe to the letter, even the parts that feel like theater. You set the collected dew in the silver pan, the moon still faintly visible through the high window. From the shelf, you take down a tiny packet of pale dust, the relic dust from the chapel's reliquary. The herbalist swore by it for lasting recall, claiming the mingling of sacred matter and nature's purest water tied the mind to what was most worth remembering than a mainstream fact. In medieval Europe, relics were not just kept in churches. They were sometimes ground, carefully, reverently, into minute quantities to be mixed with ointments or inks for blessings. Whether anyone actually did this with dew is unproven. Historians still argue whether stories of dew and relic dust are pious exaggerations or evidence of a lost branch of folk Christian practice. You pinch the tiniest bit into the pan. The dust blooms across the surface before sinking, vanishing like it was never there. Into the coil it goes, along with the required sprig of rosemary, the scent curling upward in green ribbons. You watch the vapor bead along the glass, each drop sliding down with a patience that feels rehearsed over centuries. Halfway through, you unwrap the scrap of the bride's gown, white linen, plain but fine. You dip one corner into the silver receiver, letting it sit in the growing pool of distillate. The fringe belief here is that cloth from the wearer ties the charm directly to them, like stitching their name in invisible thread. Whether it's truth or theater, you follow it, because the point is not only the result, it's the story the result carries. When the work is done, you cork the vial and seal it with beeswax, pressing the sign of a tiny cross into the warm surface. The finished liquid glints faintly, as if catching light from somewhere else. You set it aside in a padded box, ready for the steward's return, and allow yourself a small breath of relief. Another morning caught, another memory given. A vessel. Back at the cottage, you set the jar of Grove Dew on the table like it's a guest you're not entirely sure you should be hosting. The fire in the hearth is banked low, perfect for what comes next, distillation. The herbalist called it the slow persuasion, the art of convincing the dew to give up whatever it's hiding without scaring it off. You arrange the glass coil, the silver receiver, and the little copper pan that will sit over the embers. Into the pan goes the dew, clear as nothing, but somehow heavier on the ear than plain water. You add a sprig of rosemary, partly for the scent, partly because tradition insists rosemary reminds the dew what it's supposed to do. Historians still argue whether any medieval distillation of dew actually happened or whether this is a later flourish from alchemical fashion. The herbalist would have told them to argue faster, because the dew's cooling as they debate. You set the coil in place, the bent glass neck leading to the waiting silver cup. The trick is to heat it gently, letting the vapor rise slow enough to carry the subtler threads of whatever makes this dew special. Heat it too fast, and it becomes just boiled water, an unforgivable sin in this tiny, odd corner of craft. The scent changes first, still damp, but now braided with green from the rosemary and a faint mineral tang, like licking a wet stone. The vapor curls into the coil, cools, and falls in delicate drops into the cup. Each drop lands with a quiet tick, like the clock you don't own, but sometimes hear in your head on long winter nights. You add one final flourish, a dusting of ground pearl, barely a whisper's worth, swirling into the receiver as the distillate gathers. It's a fringe touch the herbalist picked up from a traveling apothecary, said to make the liquid cling to the mind the way moonlight clings to glass. Whether it works is anyone's guess, but it does give the surface a faint, silvery sheen when you tilt the cup. By the time you've collected a thimbleful, the room smells like a summer hedge after rain. You cork the silver cup's contents into a vial, seal it with beeswax, and press your thumbprint into the warm wax. The herbalist said this was the moment to think clearly about what you wanted the memory spell to hold, because your intent would be the shape the dew settled into. You think, simply, of keeping hold of the small things, the smell of grass and shade, the taste of early morning air, the sound of water falling one drop at a time. When it's done, you set the vial beside the others, its label neat: Forest Edge Harvest, Waning Moon. There's a quiet pride in the row of them, liquid fragments of days and places, each caught before the sun could scatter them. And as you bank the fire again, you can't help thinking that maybe the spell is already working. The vial from the forest edge sits cooling on the table when you hear the faint creak of a cartwheel outside. You peek through the shutter and spot Rella, the ribbon seller from 2 villages over, her cart piled high with bolts of dyed cloth and little wooden boxes. She waves up at you, her grin wide enough to push away the morning chill. Rella's here for the market day, which means the village square will be loud, bright, and temporarily convinced it's a city. You tuck the vial into your pouch, not to sell, but as something worth bartering if the right thing catches your eye. The herbalist's rules on trade are flexible. If you give away dew for bread, you're feeding the body. If you give it away for silk, you're feeding the vanity. Both have their uses. The square is already humming when you arrive. Chickens scratch under tables, and the air is stitched with the scent of baking bread, onions frying, and whatever spice the traveling cook has thrown into his pot. Rella's stall sits between a cooper selling barrels and a boy demonstrating toy windmills. Her ribbons are dyed in colors the village rarely sees: deep indigo, sharp crimson, and a blue so vivid it looks like a stolen scrap of sky. You greet her, and she eyes your pouch knowingly. "Brought me something rare?" she asks. You nod and draw out the vial, tilting it so the silvery liquid catches the light. Rella doesn't flinch. She's traded for dew before. Last spring, you gave her a drop from the May Day harvest in exchange for a roll of soft green thread. She swore it kept her from forgetting the knot patterns her grandmother taught her. She offers you a ribbon in that impossible blue, explaining it came from a dyer who uses woad and a secret bath of herbs. Historians still argue whether certain dyes held symbolic meaning in medieval trade, but you know this much: the color is rare enough that a yard of it will draw eyes for months. You hand over the vial. She slips it into her cart as naturally as if she were tucking away coin. Before you leave, Rella leans closer. "Word is, the Baron's daughter is marrying come midsummer." Her steward's been asking quiet questions about memory charms. She raises an eyebrow, then changes the subject with practiced speed. "Market gossip travels fast, but real commissions travel faster when tied to a noble's name." You wind the ribbon into your pouch, its blue winking like a secret, and step back into the churn of the square. Somewhere, between the laughter, the haggling, and the smell of roasting chestnuts, you realize you've just traded a sliver of morning for a thread of sky. And that feels exactly right. Back at the cottage, you ease the satchel onto the table, the jar inside cool and damp against your palm. The herbalist's tattered manuscript lies open nearby, its pages curling at the edges like leaves after a long summer. The ink has faded to the color of oversteeped tea, but the margin notes, those frantic little scratches she made when a thought couldn't wait, are still dark and impatient. One page in particular draws you, a section titled, in her careful hand, "Formulae for Retention." Beneath, 3 recipes for dew-infused ink, each with an ingredient list that looks like it wandered in from 3 different worlds. The first calls for May dew, soot from a lamp that's burned rosemary, and the memory of a true name whispered at dawn. The second demands rainwater from the first storm after midsummer. You frown here, knowing she told you rain was useless, mixed with gallnut powder and a single thread from the hem of a bride's gown. The third, your favorite, in its sheer audacity, lists dew from grass that has never been cut, the scrapings from a silver coin, and the breath of a dreaming hound. Historians still argue whether these mixtures were meant for actual use or if they were half metaphor, half test for apprentices. One school of thought says medieval scribes did indeed experiment with adding plant essences or mineral dust to ink, hoping to preserve documents or lend them symbolic power. Another points out that breath of a dreaming hound is logistically absurd unless you're on very good terms with the dog. You trace a finger over the margin notes where she's crossed out rainwater and replaced it with dew only. Fool. The insult isn't aimed at you, probably, but you can still hear her voice saying it. There's a fringe belief scribbled in tiny script along the page's bottom that if you write someone's name with dew-infused ink under a waxing moon, they'll remember you until their last breath. Whether that's loyalty or a curse depends entirely on the relationship, she'd once said with a sly smile. You set out your writing tools, a quill with a nib trimmed neat, a small inkwell you reserve for experiments, and a clean scrap of parchment. The idea of writing with dew feels strange every time, like trying to trap fog in a net. Still, you pour a few drops into the inkwell, watching the surface tremble before settling. The herbalist insisted on silver-handled quills for such work, claiming they speak politely to the liquid. You've tried with a wooden one before. The results were watery. Dipping the quill, you make a careful stroke. The line shines almost invisibly, catching light like spider silk. You imagine a letter written entirely this way, its words invisible, until held at a certain angle, a secret memory only revealed when the reader knows how to look. You can't prove that such ink preserves memory better than plain oak gall, but you know the stories. Lovers recalling whispered promises decades later, merchants never forgetting the terms of a fair deal, even soldiers remembering tactics they'd learned in peace. Halfway through your testing, the quill scratches a little too dry, and you pause to swirl the dew. That's when you notice another margin note on a later page. Ink will bind strongest if prepared before cockcrow. After, the day steals it. You glance at the light slipping through the shutters. It's close to the time when the first rooster will clear his throat. You hurry, scrawling a few nonsense words just to see if they'll hold the as you set the quill aside. You catch yourself smiling. These recipes may never be proven, but they keep the practice alive, just as surely as the gossip about the miller or the morning trips to the meadow. And if historians keep arguing, that's fine by you. It means the memory of the memory keepers isn't fading anytime soon. You take the jar of fresh dew and sling the satchel back over your shoulder, this time heading away from the village, past the last row of gardens where bean poles stand like sentinels in the dirt. The path narrows and dips toward the forest's edge, where the air grows cooler and the light breaks into slivers through the leaves. This is where the grass grows taller, wilder, and, if you believe the herbalist, more curious than the tamed meadows. The grove you're heading for isn't exactly forbidden, but people avoid it in that quiet, sidelong way. Once upon a time, it belonged to the Lord's family, back when they still lived in the manor on the hill. It was left to itself when the last heir vanished in a dispute no one explains clearly. Possibly over taxes, possibly over love, possibly over who got the last honey cake. Historians still argue which version is more accurate, though all agree the land went unclaimed. The dew here feels different. The blades are fine and sharp, beaded with drops that seem to hold the green deeper, as though the forest's breath itself condenses overnight. You kneel by a patch of sweet vernal grass, the kind that smells faintly of hay even when it's fresh, and touch your linen cloth to the leaves. The droplets cling stubbornly, reluctant to be coaxed away, which is exactly what you want. Herbalists say the dew that resists is the dew that remembers. There's a fringe belief that dew from within sight of an oak older than a century carries root memory, able to help a person recall knowledge they never personally learned. You glance toward the center of the grove, where a massive oak rises, bark gnarled and split like old leather. Its leaves whisper in a breeze you can't quite feel. Whether or not it's giving your dew any extra potency, it certainly gives the place an air of watching. You keep your movements quiet, less for secrecy, more out of respect for the stillness. In the distance, a jay scolds something unseen. Your antler rack passes gently over the grass, linen tips gathering the cold beads with each slow sweep. The light here is dim enough that the dew glows faintly, a silver dusting on the cloth. You wring it into a silver bowl, the sound barely more than a drip and a sigh. By the time you've filled half the jar, your knees are damp and your fingers stiff from the chill. You glance back toward the village and realize you've been gone longer than planned. But there's a quiet satisfaction in knowing that today's batch will carry not just the morning sky, but the breath of a place most people never bother to visit. And maybe, just maybe, that's the real reason it works. By the time night folds itself over the village again, you're already halfway down the lane with your gear bundled tight, heading for the meadow under a sky that looks like someone spilled a sack of diamonds across dark velvet. The moon, tonight, is waning, thin enough to look shy, but bright enough to paint silver on every roof tile. The herbalist swore the waning moon was a friend to those gathering dew for memory work. She claimed it draws thoughts inward, the way a tide draws the sea back to itself. Historians still argue whether this is a holdover from lunar planting lore or just an old woman's attempt to make you stop wasting perfectly good sleeping hours. You reach the field's edge and pause. Preparing at night is its own quiet ritual. The air smells of wood smoke and cold iron, as though the forge up the hill is dreaming in its sleep. You lay out the cloths, smooth flat on the grass, so they'll be heavy with dew come morning. The antler rack rests nearby, bone tips catching moonlight like frost. Silver bowls are set in small hollows, tilted just so to welcome the slow slide of droplets down the slope. Every angle matters. One careless tilt, and you'll come back to a dry bowl, which is a heartbreak only collectors truly understand. If there's a fringe detail you picked up from a traveling peddler, scatter a few rosemary sprigs around the cloths at night to call the dew closer. Whether it works or not, the scent drifts on the air, and you imagine each bead will wake with a faint memory of green. You've also heard of people whispering rhymes to the moon during setup, but you've never been much for poetry, unless muttering, "Don't you dare evaporate," counts. Your hands move automatically now. Weights on the cloth corners. Twine marking the path to each bowl so you don't stomp through your own harvest in the half-light. You catch your reflection in one bowl, upside down, moon-crowned, and laugh quietly. It's not regal so much as ridiculous, but the night doesn't mind. Somewhere beyond the hedgerow, an owl gives a questioning hoot. You answer it under your breath, not in words, but in the same low tone, because who knows? Maybe owls keep the best weather forecasts. The dew has yet to form thickly, but you can already see the faint shimmer beginning on the grass tips. This is when patience is tested. It's tempting to stay here, crouched, watching each bead swell. But memory spells don't require you to witness every moment. They just ask you to be ready when the time comes. You do a last check, cloth secure, bowl steady, rack positioned so the first sweep of morning will catch the richest patches. The sky has that metallic tang again, like the promise of a storm. That won't quite arrive. If the herbalist were here, she'd nod at that smell and call it a good omen, then remind you that omens don't gather themselves, be why the time you head home to sleep. The field is set like a silent banquet, each place laid for a guest that will arrive unseen. And in the quiet between your footsteps, you swear you can hear the grass breathing. Morning comes with that half-hearted light that makes you wonder if the sun overslept. You're back in the lane, boots damp from the low fog that wraps the village. Like an unwashed scarf, the meadow ahead glimmers in patches, and you can already hear the hum of early risers. Not bees, not yet, but human voices, drifting just far enough to be shapeless. As you step onto the field, you catch sight of two figures lingering by the miller's cottage. Their heads bend close, voices dipping and spiking like birdsong. You don't have to strain to know they're talking about him. The miller, again. Poor man has been the village's favorite cautionary tale ever since he skipped his due ritual one year, and, so the story goes, forgot half his grain tallies. Lost a good chunk of his harvest in trades he swears he never agreed to. To hear the gossip tell it, he once miscounted his own children, though that's probably just embellishment. Medieval folk took memory seriously in ways we'd find oddly specific now. Forgetting your prayers was one thing. Forgetting who owed you a sack of rye was practically a civic offense. And when the miller started mixing up accounts, the whispers grew sharper. He'd neglected the morning dew, and the dew had neglected him back. Historians still argue whether anyone truly believed missing the ritual could cause forgetfulness, or whether it was just a neat way to explain one man's sudden absent-mindedness without accusing him of drink. You skirt around them, pretending to be deeply invested in a patch of clover. The truth is, you've always felt a pinch of sympathy for the man. Dew gathering is patient, chilly work, and not everyone sees the point, especially if they've been doing it since they could toddle. The herbalist used to wag her finger at you whenever you grumbled, reminding you of the miller's fate, as though it were a fireside ghost story. Your bowls have done their job well overnight. In the waning moonlight that lingered just past dawn, the silver caught the droplets in a sheen, so even you have to pause to admire it. You crouch and pour carefully into your jar, the cold slipping over your fingers. The rosemary sprigs you scattered last night are still fragrant, as though they've been holding their breath for you. A little ways off, you spot the old thatcher, bent like a shepherd's crook, wringing dew from his own linen strip into a clay mug. He catches your eye, grins with a gap where a tooth should be, and calls out, "Better not skip a day, eh?" It's the same joke every time, but you laugh politely. In villages like this, repetition is its own kind of charm. You finish your sweep of the field, packing the rack and folding the cloths with the precision of habit. The gossip by the miller's cottage fades as you walk back, but you know the story will circle again. It always does, half warning, half entertainment, a way of keeping the ritual alive in conversation even for those who never bend a knee to. The grass. And maybe that's the real trick. Memory preserved not just in dew and spells, but in the telling and retelling, until even the forgetful miller becomes unforgettable. Your cottage door sighs the way old doors do when they've heard too many secrets. And there on the table sits your small arsenal of dew-catching tools, gleaming like a knight's belt of humble gadgets. First, the cloths, lengths of washed linen, soft as a lullaby and rough enough to pull water from a leaf's skin. You run your fingers across the weave, feeling the faint ridges where warp meets weft. It's no accident you use linen. Medieval households spin the stuff by habit. And by necessity, monks copy gospels under linen canopies. Even the baby tucked 2 cottages down will nap in linen swaddles before the rooster remembers his second complaint of the morning. You smile because the herbalist always said linen asks nicely, and grass tends to answer with a generous bead or two. Cotton exists in the world, yes, but in these parts it's rare and costly. Linen is your workhorse, your polite thief of droplets. Next to the cloths, your silver bowls. They're small, one armful small, and their insides curve like quiet moons. Silver isn't just for swagger. Even if nobody around you uses the word antimicrobial, plenty believe silver keeps things sweet and incorrupt. You hold a bowl by its rim. It cools your fingers with that faint coin taste you noticed. In the morning air, when you set a bowl among the grass before dawn, dew kisses the metal and clings in a thin skin, as if the moon itself had decided to put on armor. The herbalist warned you not to polish the bowls too perfectly. A hairline scratch can coax water to gather in obedient threads. Leave them a little flawed, she said, the way you leave yourself. She shared advice like that sometimes, and then accused you of being sentimental for writing it down. Then there's the antler rack, the peculiar darling of your collection. It started as a mismatched crown of shed antlers from the foresters. Winter Hall, one piece thick and pocked like old bread, another slender and elegant as a swan's neck. You drilled and fitted them together over a wooden frame so the tines reach outward, a forest of pale fingers for the grass to comb. At dawn, you drag the rack slowly over a meadow patch. Each tine grazes blades and leaves. Droplets slide along the bone like tiny acrobats and pause at wrapped linen at the tips. When you lift the rack, the cloths are starred with dew, each star a patient glimmer. It looks ridiculous. It works anyway. Fringe collectors swear antler bone remembers the cool of the night and persuades dew to keep its nerve. Historians still argue whether antlers were ever truly used for liquid gathering or whether your rack is a village-born innovation with more enthusiasm than sources. You're comfortable with both possibilities. Enthusiasm has saved many a bad plan, including last midsummer's silent wind chime made of spoons. You sort through smaller tools, reed pipettes cut from marsh stalks, a tiny funnel beaten from tin, and the ridiculous dew comb you whittled on a bored evening. The comb has teeth fine enough to whisper through clover leaves, and when it works, it feels like you're teasing secrets from plants' hair. When it doesn't, you pretend it was a back scratcher the whole time. A scribe's penknife sits there too, for trimming cloth edges and scraping wax off corks. Yes, you absolutely cut yourself with it once while demonstrating proper technique. To a goose that did not ask for a lesson. Over the hearth, your distillation setup waits like a patient spider. Dew goes in a glass belly, flame licks until vapor climbs a bent neck, and then condenses into a waiting receiver. It's a modest rig, nothing that would make an alchemist jealous, but enough to concentrate a night's breath into something. That feels like intention. The herbalist calls the result dew heart. She insists that the drop that finally leaps from the coil must fall into silver, never clay, or else the memory scatters like startled flies. Historians still argue whether medieval folk actually distilled dew this way or whether you're grafting later techniques onto older superstition. But the townspeople don't read treatises, and your results speak a language they understand. Names remembered, vows recalled, recipes and prayers clinging to the mind like burrs to wool. Speaking of burrs, your gathering cloak, a coarse thing with hem weights sewn into the edges. You used to kneel to wipe grass with linen, but the cloak lets you swish through a patch, the weighted hem pressing into blades and collecting dew along a stitched band of absorbent cloth. The band can be wrung into bowls with a twist that makes your wrists ache pleasantly. On especially generous mornings, you tie the cloak between two stakes to drip into a row of bowls. A slow, tinkling patience that pairs nicely with quiet humming and the smug knowledge that you're stealing treasure. While the world is still yawning, you pull open a drawer and take out the little silver strainer that makes you feel like a noble at tea. It's punched with stars and moons, supposedly to let wayward sky pass while catching leaf bits. Fringe as that sounds, you humor the superstition and note, privately, that it does in fact keep beetles out of your distillate. You once found a ladybird floating there, legs bicycling in calm confusion. You gave her a reed to climb and explained, very gently, that this was a memory project, not a spa. There's a flat stone too, smooth as a lullaby, that you keep by the basin. You lay damp cloths across it so the cold seeps upward and encourages droplets to gather instead of vanishing. Some say stone anchors do. Others say it's just colder than wood. You don't fight over it. You simply watch the cloth darken, and that feels like explanation enough. Beside the stone rests a packet of herbs: rosemary, sage, a little sweet woodruff. Traditionalists scent their dew lightly before use, telling you the nose carries memory, as surely as ink carries words. That part is plain truth. A whiff of rosemary takes you back to last winter's kitchen, to steam and laughter, and the herbalist muttering that rosemary is for remembrance, the way if you repeat something enough times it becomes a fact. Shakespeare will later make the same point, but he hasn't been born yet, and you're not supposed to know that. Time travel is bad manners. Still, scent matters. You'll add one crushed rosemary sprig during distillation, not for power, you tell yourself, but for kindness to the future nose that will meet this vile dot on the shelf. Corks in a jar of beeswax, soft enough to seal without cracking, firm enough to keep the moon from leaking out, which is absolutely not how physics works and absolutely how the herbalist describes it. There's twine for tags, because nothing says ancient ritual like a neat label with the date and field noted, along with the provincial weather report scribbled in the margin. You've lost too many nameless vials to the great forgetting. Cupboard to skip the tag. Organization is your new superstition. A mainstream fact straight from village practice. On May mornings, people collect May dew to wash faces for clear skin and good fortune. You keep one bowl expressly for those early days, when even the skeptical Miller lines up to splash his cheeks and pretend he isn't hoping to remember where he put the ledger. You don't advertise this. Your memory work feels different, quieter, less festive, but you're not opposed to good skin. Good skin helps everyone feel like their thoughts fit more comfortably in their heads. That's joke number one. In case you're counting the quota like the tax collector counts chickens. You lay everything out in order: cloths, antler rack, bowls, funnels, strainer, herbs, corks, and breathe the slow, content breath of a person with a tidy workbench. Tools don't make the magic. You remind yourself. They make the patience possible. Without patience, even silver is just moon-colored metal. Without humor, even a working antler rack is just a strange hat for a very tall deer. There's joke number two. You'll get your third in a moment. We keep our promises around here. Before you begin ringing, you check the jar from the meadow, lifting it to the window. The dew trembles at the glass, not yet ready to choose a side. You swirl it once, wait for the beads to coalesce, then pour into the largest silver bowl with a small ceremony, a nod to the east, a whispered thank you to the night, and a quick glance toward the shelf where the herbalist keeps her scowl for special occasions. You settle the bowl beneath the antler rack's linen tips and start the dripping. Tick, tick. The room keeping time with a patient's metronome. Point one last tool. A book. Not your manuscript of incantations, just a ledger with tidy lines where you record the harvest, field, hour, moon's shape, wind's mood, the color of dawn like peach against tin. Historians still argue whether such records ever accompanied folk practices like this, or if you're simply an unusually fussy villager. You argue back, silently, that the future has a right to know what the past smelled like. And that is joke. Number three, you're keeping the past in little jars, like jam, except the fruit is weather and the sugar is moonlight. Spread lightly on the day and it might keep. You roll your shoulders, pick up the reed pipette, and begin moving dew from bowl to coil, drop by careful drop, tools whispering to one another in the hush. With every small motion, the room feels steadier, as if the right tools, in the right order, are a lullaby you hum with your hands.